Hello, Quines Cast listeners. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the bonus episode for season 2 of Quines Cast. It's a little different from our usual. It's a kind of discussion-based episode, which we recorded at the Edinburgh International Book Festival in August 2023. We are on a break just now, but we will hopefully be back with you next year. And in the meantime, please enjoy this special bonus episode.
Hello everyone, welcome to Quines Cast, Scotland's feminist arts podcast. I'm Hannah Lavery.
And I'm Caitlin Skinner, and we're going to start off tonight with some music from Emma Pollock.
Hey everybody.
Every day is hell-bent on delivering fresh heaven sent. My focus disappears, my mind inhales hypotheses. Rogues and thieves, you know, they masquerade as new ideas. And as the thunder peals, the damage done becomes revealed. Only move by standing still. Forget the views beyond the hill. You've got this upside down, so pour it out. Don't like to say hello, but love, if you might help me make it so. I hate the introduction, but still revel in a deconstruction. You've got lots to talk about, but I prefer to walk about. Give the moment center stage before we turn another page. Can only move by standing still. Forget the views beyond the hill. You've got this upside down, so pour it out. Too many numbers and not enough poetry. I let them fight to the death, but will they be the death? The death of me. The doors we leave ajar, just let the breeze in from afar. Reminds me of the dalliance that I enjoy with second chances. My legs still proceed, but whirling thoughts, well, they just bury me. 'Cause every day is new, you see, and grows another branch of my future tree. Only move by standing still. Forget the views beyond the hill. You've got this upside down, so pour it out. Can only move by standing still. Forget the views beyond the hill. You've got this upside down. Too many numbers, but will they be the death? The death of me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. This is our second year here at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and it's an absolute delight to be here. Our event tonight is supported very gratefully by Sir Ewan and Lady Brown. We want to thank them so much. And yes, we are recording this live event for our special bonus episode of season 2 of Quines Cast. Quines, if you didn't know, is a Scottish word for women, and each episode of Quines Cast we choose a theme and we invite leading feminist authors, playwrights, poets, and musicians to respond to the theme through performance. But for this bonus episode, we have got a few moments of performance throughout, but we've invited back some of the contributors from throughout our last series to come together and open the floor to dig a little deeper into some of those themes that we've been exploring, as always, from a feminist point of view.
So we are joined today by the wonderful author and activist Jessica Gaitán Johannesson, writer and mediator, though I've read this as meditator, but maybe you are also a meditator, but mediator Clementine E Burnley, who's also got a debut collection of poetry out, and Jessica's also got an essay collection called Nerves and Their Endings, before I forget. The wonderful playwright Maryam Hamidi, and musician, as we've already heard, Emma Pollock. Each of them are going to bring a question from one of our 4 episodes, and the 4 episodes were on the themes this time of riot, loss, pleasure, and education. So they're going to each offer a question that then we will discuss as a group.
Yes, and as I said, at the end of the evening, we'll have some more music from Emma, but we did want to bring you some moments of performance as well, because that's a big part of Quines Cast. So at this point, we're going to invite Clementine to read from her new pamphlet, Radical Pairing.
Thank you very much. So this poem is called Wolf. Though our ancestors hunted her kind through highland forests 10,000 years ago, though nettles grow up over hill scars, through a stand of dock she watches, curious. Boys lay a perimeter of piss around a canvas tent. Triangled ears turn to the sounds of their small, safe deaths, their tenderness. A wolf is spotted aboard a train in Brussels, in pubs on the Polish-German border. Instead of musk deer, staghorn ferns are nailed to wooden trophy boards. She leaves a boggy stink in stairwells near Glasgow Green. The treads never wash clean of her. Watchfires linger after 3 pregnant wolves are shot on the way to France. Near the Forest of Dean, a dog walker raises the alarm. When night blots out the purple of Pennyroyal, the search for wolves is abandoned. Among brambles so thick, a pizza box is a smudge in the surveillance footage. The DNA profile captured in her scat is tagged lone female. She leaves a paw print between the daylilies. The shadow of an overhead power line marks her flank. Thank you very much. And I'm going to read another one called How to Eat Frogs. Grandmothers croak welcome. Crows watch from a sagging power line while I unpack the bulky suitcase. Grandmothers test me with my sisters engaged to marry sons of the soil. Grandmothers think my nose ring is for free girls. Ask, did you swallow cloven hoofs or horse meat? So why do you rob our peace? Do your shoulders move one by one when you dance them wire? Who fed you eggs before you were 2? Who named you Swallow? Where is your umbilical buried? What can anything at your tongue? In the market between purple pyramids of piled up tomatoes, orange kulubar and bush plums, grandmothers ask, How many homeboys has your any kind careless talk mouth thrown away? The cool palm is benediction to my forehead before grandmothers squat at the fireplace, muttering, "If you're going to cook a white frog, choose a fat one. If you're going to eat snails, don't expect to win a 100-meter dash." I'm asking my grandmothers if we were too much, too soon, too loud, too young. "We all need sweetness," they reply, "but would you rather be a meal or a snack?" My grandmothers ask, if you give the milk away for free, who's going to buy the cow?
Thank you, Clementine. That was wonderful. And please get hold of the pamphlet when you can, because it's an absolute joy. Okay, so we should begin our discussion. The first theme in our series was riot, where we explored the themes of activism, protest, but also that inner riot. And Jessica, I think you're going to start us off with a question for the rest of the group.
Where and how have you seen art help create political change? That's my question.
I just saw some. I went on recommendation to see Dark Noon, and I feel awful because I can't remember the name of the amazing South African theatre company, but we were also talking earlier about the sensation of watching something that is utterly explosive in the way it's pushing boundaries, both thematically but also in the medium. And it feels like when I've seen it, it's been courage and it's been risk-taking. And when I haven't seen it, it's when it's been fearful and sanitized and cleaned up and buffed perfectly into a perfect diamond. And it's the roughness, I think, when it feels like art has the power to truly penetrate and change and be, whether that's political or just a movement inside. I think that's, for me, when I felt it really potently, something raw. But that was a phenomenal piece of theatre if you've got any nights left at the festival to go and see it.
And it was quite extraordinary. So this piece of theatre was a South African theatre group telling the story of the building of the American West. And it was just an incredible piece of switching the gaze. I thought was really powerful to have South Africans tell the story of the creation of America and to foreground the violence of America and what colonization meant. And I just think there was something really powerful, wasn't it, about switching the way in which we sort of understand history.
And that viewpoint and exactly that kind of the permission to tell the history, but truly tell it how histories have been told of ourselves. You know, if you're from a culture that's been orientalized, or for me as an Iranian woman, sometimes I deal with what that sort of the orientalism that's afflicted our viewpoints of that region of the world. And also I know lots of people, global majority, have experienced what that gaze does to kind of like your histories. And that was the radicalism of just seeing the viewpoint shift felt really powerful. And yeah,
and that idea of the shift. Emma, do you have any sort of art that strikes you?
It's a much broader observation, I suppose, but being a musician during the Scottish independence movement, music and art became phenomenally important. Regardless of the way that anyone voted, it actually began to push the idea of what we created as a country historically, what we were creating now, and what we could create in the future should we have become independent. And it redefined an artistic uniqueness, credibility, force, right, that was geographically pinned down in a way that I don't think it had been before then. It did seem that the arts were majority pro because there seemed to be a belief that the arts brings a belief in change and in active creation, which was reinforced through the significant body of work that was created during that period and the way that we redefined a lot of what it is to be a Scottish artist. We had formed Chemical Underground Records back in 1995 when our band began. And that at the time, and I didn't realise it until much later, that at the time was an act of defiance. That was an act of all the bands that had to go down to London previously in the 80s to actually make a career for themselves. And boy, did they do it. They did it through major record companies. They did it effectively. They became incredibly successful. But the industry was different then. And actually, over the past 20 odd years, that we've been around as a record company, we've seen a real force of musical, creation and delivery and distribution all around the world, based in Scotland. And I think that's been reinforced further through the independence movement. I think it's a potent idea what the arts can do geographically.
That's really interesting as well. Like, I think you touch on the grassroots of movements and what the art feels to create, as well as what it obviously serves in terms of a connection with the recipient. And I think, there's another way of looking at that question as well, about the activism of community work and the activism of working in a grassroots level with young people and people who don't have, aren't enfranchised in a way to feel like certain art forms are accessible to them on a consumer basis, like that there needs to be some, interventionist opportunities created to kind of give access. But once those spaces are created, and when I say that sounds in itself kind of like an outsider coming in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can be grassroots from within those communities, but it feels like the power to change is sometimes in the earth, in the grassroots.
I would pick up from that actually, because that brings together some of the strands that you already began with. The thing that came to me was not a single person, a single artist. It was really the movements which have been political grassroots movements. For instance, if you look at what happened in Latin America, in Brazil, and in Cuba with culture called Ifa, which is one of the largest world religions, from it's not a small place in Nigeria. One group of people, the Yoruba, taken to Latin America, enslaved, just managed to persuade everybody else to adopt their language, their religion, and their way of playing drums. And that has kept a strand of culture, material culture, alive for 400 years. And that is practice, in that it's not only ritual and celebration, but it's also a way of moving its drum rhythms, and to preserve that, I think, intact. And this is what they used when they would rebel. So it was a kind of foundation also for revolution, a foundation for survival, and it's very active still today. So in the diaspora, they take it back to Nigeria. And the idea that that's not tribal, because often these are thought to be things which are to do with people who are related. They're completely unrelated. They're from all over Africa, and some of them not even from Africa, but they all decided that they would practice the same art form. Yeah, I find that really inspiring.
Yeah, and also, well, for there to be preservation in the sense of folk art having the potency to essentially look backwards and maintain, sustain cultural forms in an original shape and way and style, versus what is the kind of permanent kind of cycle of evolution and moving forwards and forwards and forwards with art forms. That in itself, that's like a really interesting tension, because it feels like both those things need to exist to sustain a culture.
Yeah, I loved those answers. I think my question came from a point of, I think I've been thinking a lot about what we mean when we say that art changes the world, and what is the concrete reality of that. And particularly, I suppose, coming from a book perspective in an industry that has its own problems. And I think a lot about, for example, the summer of 2020 and all the lists of these are the books that you should read to be a good ally. And I often think about, like, what was the material result of that within the industry, for example. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and also just in terms of kind of my own activism and climate justice, what are the things that make me feel like I have to go out and do something, like concretely, practically make a change.
Great, thanks. Here we are at the book festival, and that question of the connection between the arts and change making has been quite heightened this month, because there's been some activism around the Divest Edinburgh Book Festival campaign, which Jessica has been a part of, and we wanted to create a bit of space here actually to hold the nuance of that conversation and maybe get a bit of responses from our panel. Jess, you've been really involved in that campaign. Do you want to give us a little bit of a explanation about what's been happening? What are the questions that you've been asking?
Yeah, for those of you who are kind of not aware of it, earlier in the summer, the Scottish publication The Ferret made it public that Baillie Gifford, which is the main sponsor of this festival, has investments that amount to up to £5 billion in companies that make a profit from fossil fuels extraction. At that point, when you kind of find out about that I think as any author really, but particularly as someone like myself who writes about climate activism and about climate justice and is also involved with climate justice organising, you're kind of left with this decision about what to do about that. Because I think for me, definitely, and for a lot of people who signed this open letter to the festival, it felt like it doesn't feel right to sit on a stage and talk about these things without also addressing the conditions that make those conversations possible. Because at the end of the day, I think what's important to say is that the climate crisis that we're seeing and climate collapse has been made possible by hiding harm. Because that's what extraction is. It's you hide harm far away from the kind of end product, and that's the very heart of the colonialist project. So I think if we don't talk about it, then we're sort of just feeding into the hiding of it. And the other really important thing to say is that, which I think has been lost a little bit in the kind of coverage of this, is that Baillie Gifford is an investment firm. It's not a bank. And banks are a lot easier in some ways to actually scrutinize and to see where the money goes, whereas investment firms are kind of known to be very opaque. So there is a reason why we didn't know about this. And very often, people who are the end product of it, they don't know where the money comes from. So I think this is a much, much bigger conversation to have about where funding comes from for these conversations that we're having.
Yeah, there is a horrible irony about the whole thing, that we're sitting here and we're able to talk freely about something that we all care about greatly and we hope is of value to the public, the arts. And yet the music industry that I know has changed beyond all recognition since streaming has come on board, and now most of us many of us are having to be funded by either privately finding our own finances to even make a record now. We run a recording studio in Scotland as well, and we've seen an absolutely enormous shift towards private funding. Probably about 90% now, actually, of the artists that come through our door are having to be funded by themselves. And they're doing it out of love. But many folks, they don't have that option, so they just don't get to make the art. So the very fact that we're actually not able to afford to make the art in the first place also begs the question, how does our society value that now at all? And why is it not possible to make it? Why do we have to look to those companies that are making such a huge profit in areas that are a huge problem regards climate change? why is it that we're in that we have this imbalance and it needs to be addressed?
Let's pass this conversation along, and if you want to widen that out as well. But I mean, I always think that conversation is a form of activism, and I feel that it's holding those sort of kind of nuances and I suppose a level of contradiction of how we fund the arts, I think is probably the question at the heart of this. I don't know, Maryam, if you've got anything to...
I think I guess my thought process went a little bit to the activism that's taken place at this festival this year as well, and how that in itself is performative in some sense. And I mean that with power. I don't mean that to undermine it. I think it exists in a powerful sense because it's within the context of something happening now, and it can be felt. If the book festival didn't happen next year, so this is a tricky thing. If the book festival didn't happen next year because one of their key funders pulled out because of the controversy, then where is the space in which we can shine a light on poor practice, shady funding? You know, there's a strange and uncomfortable place in which we have to have these conversations, and I'm saying that like with full awareness that I don't have an answer there, and I'm grappling with it. But I'm interested in how the activism here exists within the frame of this happening now. And if this isn't happening now, there isn't a way of challenging. And so there's something about, the divestment movement having to be articulated within the context of like, is this space now that we're able to talk about this having more of an impact than if the book festival didn't exist next year? I don't know. It's difficult because obviously you look at so many huge arts organisations across Scotland, across the UK, and that oil money is running like veins through our entire creative industries. And that divestment, it can happen in this space, I guess, but it's also about, as individuals acting collectively, choosing to divest. As citizens, we have to do that, right? It's kind of, we can put pressure and we can raise awareness, but like actually the raising of awareness, it comes upon ourselves to make those choices, to look at clean funds, to look at, investment firms, if you're lucky enough to be like, I'm just putting some money in investments. It's a lot of money in oil, apparently. Say that from the Middle Eastern perspective. But yeah, it's sort of... So I don't know. I think so coming back to that thought about the performance of activism, how is it most potent? How is it most effective? What are the spaces in which it can really open us and make us consider really deeply and meaningfully and challenge ourselves to change? And where does it shut us off? And I know that it's the worst having to think about that, because we all have compliance in so many ways.
I think it's messy. When I think about it, I just think this is really messy and complicated, and it would be ridiculous to expect to come up with an answer to a situation which has taken global effort for well on 200 years, I think. One of the dangers, I think, because I think back to the 90s when I was on university campuses in Glasgow, and at the time it was the South African situation, and that was supposed to be impossible, and that was going to ruin the economy as well. And we didn't think that much about it. We just went out and demonstrated, And somehow that situation shifted, and it didn't shift towards a place of perfection, but we achieved things in that movement. Nelson Mandela came out of prison. The government of South Africa changed. I remember Margaret Thatcher at the time saying that sanctions weren't the answer. It turned out to be the answer, So it's interesting, because I lived through that time. At the same time, I was born on a plantation. And I come from a country which actually quite similarly to Scotland is quite dependent on oil and gas for its major income. Cameroon has a massive, recently discovered gas field in the Gulf of Guinea. It has been, since it was a British colony, it has delivered resources to this part of the world. And so I would be very concerned if this conversation becomes disconnected from the fact that the African continent is now the most energy deprived continent on the planet. And that literally means that the lights don't come on. So we had regular power cuts all the way through my childhood. And when there is no power, it's not even a question of air conditioning and heating. When there's no power, there's no supply to machines in hospital. You have to burn diesel, very dirty diesel in generators. And those generators belong to people who have a lot of money, because we all know the price of diesel at the moment. So things like divesting, I think, is shifting into another kind of economy and hoping that it will be a fairer kind of economy, because the people who live in the back offices of the world, where all of the dirty work gets done, for clean energy to be delivered to the center which is having the conversation, are not necessarily the people who are able to actually join the political discussion about how this is done. And for me, it's not a question of whether it's done, because the science is clear for all of us. The question is how you do it while hurting the least amount of people possible, because these people are burning solid fuels. So that's animal dung and that's wood, which is carbon still, and they're going blind from the particulates which are in the fuels which they're using right now, right? So these are the things that I think about in terms of making this shift, but making this shift in the right way so that people who already are living very deprived lives don't end up actually bearing the brunt of the cost for this.
Can I make a final wee comment on that? Yeah, because I feel like so much of what you said, they're just such core conversations being had everywhere in terms of what does climate justice mean? And very often I feel like it ends up kind of pitting, and there's a reason for that, pitting vulnerable groups against each other. The people who are suffering because of the extraction and the people who are dependent on the industry for various reasons. And it happens here in Scotland as well. You know, you've got communities that are living next to an oil refinery and they are suffering from energy poverty. So it's like, how is that possible? So somewhere this money is not going to the right people. Like this money is making millionaires. And I think that is just like at the core of it, this is a question of inequality that is global and that we kind of can't let our eyes off, I think.
We're going to move on to talk about our next theme, which was the theme of loss. And we explored in the episode all different types of loss, bereavement, but also losing friendship, letting go, the losses that we incur as we get older, as our lives change. And we have asked Clementine to ask a question of the panel.
What have you learned about loss?
Oh, goodness me. I've lost both my parents over the last 5-6 years, and that's been very difficult. But at the same time, it's one of the most natural cycles in life. It kind of makes you think, well, why is it so difficult when we know that it is one of the most fundamental losses and natural losses that we're going to experience. But it does kind of make you appreciate that life, all of our lives have an arc of growth, building, and as we get older, it begins to turn. We begin to lose things, and it's quite frightening. I think when you're young, everything's about build. Every damn thing. You know, we're told it's about building. We're taught that it's about building, and we build friendships, and we build partnerships, and we build families, and everything gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the Christmas dinner gets massive and really stressy, but fun. And then there's a tipping point. it feels to me, when we begin to grow apart from our friends. People move away, we lose our parents, and we have to remember during our lives when we are younger, if I can impart upon anyone, I don't know, the first 30, 40 years of their life, just treasure that. Just hold on to it. Understand what it is the best you can, while still being as carefree as you can with the first few decades of your life, because it's a necessary arc, but it's a tough one. Time is wonderful with these things. Time is the best healer that there is. But fundamental loss is necessary, but appreciate what we have every day we have it.
That's quite a hard challenge, to appreciate everything every
day.
As much as you can.
as much. I try and sit, be still, and understand what makes your life valuable, and take a moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's really affected me quite deeply, what you said about the tipping point. I think I've just hit 40 and I feel like I'm just teetering on a fucking downward slope. But no, I mean it like in a meaningful way. Like I feel like I'm recognizing the loss, the distancing maybe, the spaces, the slippages of it, of time and of yourself, and I think it ties into a question I'll have a bit later on as well, but about kind of the redefining. For me, there's such pathos in that, and I think the thing of telling yourself or telling somebody else, make the most of this, enjoy this. I can imagine how that's going to land like a lead balloon with my own kids. But I think what's interesting about that is that there is obviously the counterpoint is that exists because you do live without, you don't itemize and you don't inventory and you don't value every moment and everything. And maybe you shouldn't, because if you did, you'd be a really boring person. If you just sat there going, this is good, because actually, I guess the loss is not just of the joyful, perfect, pristine moments, right? It's also of the crusty, shaky, the joyless moments sometimes as well, and like life in all of its naked glory. And I feel for me loss resonates as the loss of selves just feels like a constant cycle, and in that comes the rediscovering of self. I feel like there is a downward slope, but there's also with losing some things comes discovery, and you're like, oh, who's this new version of you? And obviously grief is a completely different thing to place into that, because that's not the same. But when I think about loss in that sense, it feels for me a lot about the self. And
yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm not going to say too much more because we obviously need to hear from everyone else. But yeah, that's a true thing. In the loss of those who know you best, because I'm an only child. Loss of those who brought you into the world is kind of tough because there's no one you can ask anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's extraordinary when that goes.
When we did the podcast, Catherine Simpson did the provocation. She talked about turning 60. One of my favourite things she said is, I've got no more fucks to give. I've lost that. And I remember just going, oh, that sounds great. Turn 60 and I don't care anymore. I don't care what people think of me. I've lost all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about grief and loss being separate things, because I think when I just see the word, I probably go to more like grief, maybe, whereas actually they aren't the same thing. And just like you were saying, I think what I was thinking about was how, so my mother died 5 years ago now, when I was 32, I'm now 38. And what I feel with loss is that it doesn't happen once when you lose a person. Like, you kind of lose them again and again as you grow older, because you become a different person as you grow older. So what you kind of think of as this, like, you know, the loss of a loved one or something, is this cataclysmic event that kind of happens once, is actually much more a kind of repeating thing. That's something that I've learned.
And Clementine, do you want to add anything?
I do want to add a few things, because when I was thinking about this question, I had a few answers myself. But now, having listened to all of you, I think what remains for me to say is that it just seemed to me as if there are layers to loss, you know. So there are the personal losses, which are quite devastating. But I remember before I had children, I sort of took my body for granted. And then I looked in the mirror and I sort of went, oh my God! I didn't really appreciate everything that sort of pointed upwards, you know? And so I thought about that and I thought, if I'd realized that, I would have taken really flattering photographs of myself when I was pregnant. All of these people with their lovely naked bellies. And then I thought, I lost the idea of myself like that. And then I gained another idea of myself, and that was interesting. And then I lost the ability to care what people thought about me, you know. So I've also lost the shyness of going into a bar and sitting there by myself and having a drink, because I know nobody's going to approach me. So I can just sit there with my book and I can have my drink, and I love that, you know. And I also have lost being very visible, because now I am sort of invisible. I really enjoy that, you know. So there are all of these losses, and I look forward to more losses somehow.
Well, I'm glad that you've said this, because this is definitely at the opposite end of the spectrum, so thank you. I feel much
I think
better.
we should talk more about the loss of gravity. I think that's there's very much a thing that happens to our bodies where we it loses the perkiness of youth. Let's just say that.
Thanks, everyone. That was really good. So yes, the third episode, the third in our season, we looked at pleasure. We looked at sexual pleasure, guilty pleasure, not guilty pleasure. Maryam, you've brought us a question.
Yeah. So my question is, how has getting older redefined what brings you pleasure?
Yeah, I find that word really difficult. And so I almost feel, thank you for prompting me to think about it, because I think in my mind, I immediately went to sexual pleasure. And I think there's a reason for that. And that's because for a long time, I kind of didn't feel like that word was for me. And then when I started coming out as queer and I was on the asexual spectrum, I was like, oh, there are so many different kinds of pleasure, and I actually get to define that for myself. And that is I feel like a huge kind of liberation. So that is a massive thing that I've learned as I've gotten older, that what was out there, I didn't have to worry about, basically, which I think, relates to many of our experiences of pleasure anyway.
I really like that answer, because I started off in that place as well. And the thing that's changed as I've gotten older is that I have expanded so that I'm really at the center of my own experience. I'm no longer thinking about, I do think about other people, and other people are a major source of pleasure for me. But the idea that, because a lot of pleasure, whether it's sexual or not, has to do with how I negotiate actually relationships. The thing that has happened to me as I've grown older is getting more comfortable with this idea about consent. what I'm agreeing to, what I'm explicitly asking for, what I'm receiving, what I'm allowing. And something that have been thinking about quite a lot at the moment is the idea that there is internal consent before there's external consent, right? So usually people are thinking about other people crossing their boundaries in terms of giving and receiving pleasure. But actually, it's very hard for somebody to cross an external boundary before I have crossed an internal boundary myself, right? So I'm really thinking in a very nuanced way about what I permit and why I permit these things. And one of the greatest sources of pleasure in my life now is just being alone, completely alone in my apartment, pottering about, watering my plants, and having my thoughts in my head, And that just seems like a huge luxury after being in a family of 7 people and then raising a family, and now almost alone as the last one sort of finishes school this year.
That's beautiful. For the pottering. So, pottering pleasure. It's real.
But I must water mine. Clearly haven't reached that particular stage in my life where I remember to water them and take pleasure out of it. I don't think I knew what I found pleasurable until much later in life, because I was too goddamn busy doing the things that I thought I should be doing. And the funny thing is that I was in a band for a long time. We were together for 10 years, between the ages of roughly 25, 35. And we achieved a whole lot. We did a load. It was amazing. We also formed the record company, the recording studio, they're still going. And the funny thing is that band split up because we were sick and tired of each other. Even though the work that we'd created was of huge value to us and had transcended really bad personal relationships within that band. And then this year we got back together. And after 18 years apart. And we toured and we did festivals and we just played our last gig that's scheduled just a few days ago. And that has been one of the most incredibly pleasurable things, reconnecting with people that I thought I would never have a connection with in a real sense again. Singing these songs that I never thought I'd get a chance to sing again because I thought that I didn't have the right to sing them without the people around me who made them with me, even though I've had a solo career since. And I never thought that there could be the maturity in all of us to actually come back together in a room and not just tolerate each other, but actually actively love and support each other. And that has been extraordinary to go through. And to know that there's a future is absolutely incredible. I never thought it was possible.
Yeah, I feel like all these observations and answers just, they're nurturing me right now because I feel like I'm at a point where I'm asking a lot of questions about this myself, and a lot of it's to do with the conversation inside about, do I consent to this? Is it that sort of Marie Kondo thing of holding a thing? Does this spark joy? Like holding one of your kids. Well, does this spark joy? But my kids do spark joy. But like, it's interesting about the sense of like, how much of the notions around pleasurable activities, for example, that I have just kind of habitually felt, performatively habitually have done, and somehow it's only you kind of get to a point where you sort of assess the sensation and you go, this is not fun, or this isn't sparking joy. And I think, it ties in a lot to that. And Clementine, you really articulated that simple, quiet, internal conversation. And I think as well, it's partly about getting older. It's also post-pandemic, and I feel like the lockdowns, as well as doing a number on us, they also kind of introduced ourselves to ourselves, and that process kind of in itself uncovered, what am I like in perpetual silence? And that in itself was quite, radical and revolutionary internally for some of us. And I feel like I learned a lot about finding pleasure, like quiet time on my own is really nice, and finding, hanging laundry in the garden when the sun is going to be out on those 3 days of the Scottish summer, for some reason is a really pleasurable task. And I'm like, why is it about that? What is it? It's because it's down the bottom of the garden and none of my kids can find me. But so it's interesting. I feel like all of these, whilst you have different responses, they feel like they tie in to my therapy for me. Thank you. I'll stop talking.
We are here to serve. I was just going to say, I find the idea of hobbies very interesting, because I was told quite recently, get a hobby. Literally my best friend just it's time, because I just had this idea that no, but I do, I don't get paid to do activism, so that's my hobby. And they were like, no, it really isn't. That's not, So it's just interesting in this society where we are told that we are, the value of us is what we produce, to carve out things that are just for pleasure.
I feel like there needs to be a life coach person that's not about career development and all of that. They're like hobby development, and they only speak to you about what would be good hobbies for you. And because I'm the same, I don't have hobbies and I need a hobby.
Exactly. Should we move on to this? So our final episode in season 2 of Quines Cast was about education. So I feel like, I think, Emma, you have a question for us on education.
Yeah. Okay, so this question, I put it to my boy who's 21 last night, and he said, Mum, it's not very good. So I added another single word to it to try and make it less not good. So I apologise to everyone who has been subjected to this. But okay, so education, who or what is it for? Yeah, I know, horribly vague. It was even more vague before that.
Why were you drawn to that question?
Okay, because it struck me watching my son go through choosing a course recently, that there are so many more opportunities to learn now than there were when I went to university back in '89. And that it's a very, very interesting idea that education be opened up to as many people as possible. But then one day it struck me that, okay, here's the thing about it, at the other end, there's society's need. What does society do, depending on the country and where they are, whether they're a growing country with a fledgling economy, with priorities? What does a society do when it comes to trying to put together an infrastructure for education? And how does that differ from the individual's needs? And it also made me think about the internet and how it's completely changed our access to education. And that now, if I have a broken tumble dryer, I can go to YouTube, which is always fun and sometimes works. And so we actually have this incredibly accessible portal that allows us to learn pretty much anything we like in loads of different mediums. And I know now, for me, that one of the pleasures in later life has become education, because I went back to the Open University to study music, even though I'd never really done it. I did physics at university when I was young. And I went back to the OU to do music during COVID, and it was one of the most pleasurable things I've ever done. So it became a safe haven. It became something that was nourishing, nurturing, useful, and empowering. My intent was to basically say, look, that this isn't just a kid choosing a course to go to uni. This is much bigger now in its access and its potential.
When the first time I thought about education is when I wanted to read a book by myself, right? Because I couldn't read properly, and so I was sort of sounding the words out. And then my mother taught me how to read because she's a teacher. And then I found the middle book of the Tolkien trilogy. So I read The Two Towers, and then I waited for 9 years. So I found all of these things quite problematic somehow, you know. And then my parents basically were like, you really are going to have to pay rent, your own rent. So that's why you go to university, you get a job, and then you buy things, right? And then when I became a mother, I discovered I wanted my children to go to school so the house would be empty, so that I could clean up what they had done, right? And then, so it's like basically a mass containment system so that the parents can get money to, obviously it's for the parents. I don't know what happens to teachers because they're also parents, but that's a different matter. And then the children sort of start to leave home, and it's still about earning money in order to buy things, right? But then I discovered at some point that I was extremely terrified of death. And so I thought, I will do a psychotherapy course because this will teach me how to die. And so I'm in the middle of a psychotherapy course, and they have taught me how to die. So I was on a plane, actually, Hannah, because I had to come to this panel this morning. And it was very bad weather. And I did one of the things I learned in this psychotherapy course, which I would recommend to anybody, because obviously nobody except me is afraid of dying. But I sat in seat number 16D, and I did an exercise called letting go and dying. And so I let go and I died. And the point is, after you've let go and died, you're pretty much fine. So I was fine for the rest of my flight. See? And we landed. And so education, you see, these are important things. Learning how to die is a very important thing, right? I wish that we learned more important things like that. Learning how to knit, learning how to die, learning how not to kill your children before they go to school.
I feel like what you're articulating here is learning when you need to learn something, like the need being the thing that drives you. I need to learn this, read this book. Mum, show me how to read. Yeah. And I need to cope with the idea of dying. So yes, I'm going to learn about psychotherapy.
And I'll just add one more thing, because in the pandemic, we were going to learn how to grow potatoes, because we decided that well,
you were.
I'll stop now. We want to learn from you.
Did you learn how to grow potatoes?
No, we decided that because we were on an island in the Inner Hebrides, we'd rather eat limpets than grow potatoes. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Jessica.
Education, what is it for? I guess I thought about two different things. One was kind of formal education versus like what is education really, and what counts as education, and who decides that. Because really education is like everything you learn, from, how to brush your teeth to like learning language from the people around you from when you're a very small child. Like that is a kind of education. So really it's about like just adapting you to the world that surrounds you, and understanding, I suppose, like how you interact with your world. And what I started thinking about, rabbit hole, was, who decides that? And especially in terms of formal education now, that we're like seeing, on both sides of the Atlantic, people kind of changing curriculums and going like, oh yeah, slavery was good. Like, and that kind of like bizarre stuff, it just made me think a lot about how all types of education is really about a story that someone's decided to tell, that this is the story that we are passing on to other people, which, you know, it's hugely powerful and kind of scary when you think about it.
But it's also the idea about we're educating people to serve the society. Yes. That we want. So like we want to educate people because you want them to, you know, work this. So, you know, like a lot of the way our conversations about education about is we need these workers. So we're going to educate everyone to be these workers because that's what society wants. And actually, I wonder whether there's a sort of question about we're living in this kind of polarized, we're living in a way we've almost lost the ability, the art of conversation. Not us lot.
Not Clementine, no.
But we've lost that sort of art, and actually maybe what we need to do is be educating people about how to, and also if we've got all this data, it's like maybe the need for what we need to educate people is how to cope with the data, how to analyse, how to problem solve, how to be discerning and how to be critical. And yet it seems like you said across the Atlantic, it's like, no, we're not going to read any books about, you know, queer people. We're not going to read any books about, you know, Black lives. You know, like all of that stuff's been taken off because actually the fear that we create citizens that can be questioning, and you know. So I think like who is it for feels really interesting.
The other thing that occurred to me, I guess, was the whole idea that I've often seen education as understanding the filter through which the individual sees the world, and for me, I've always been quite a technical person. I've always liked to understand systems and why the planets turn the way they do, and I've always been really interested in science. It's something that runs through my life and the way that I approach it and the way that I go about it. And for someone to kind of find something that they feel really passionate about and then go study it, I think there's a huge amount of self-discovery that happens with that as well, which is really, really valuable, rather than perhaps the societal need of, right, you should go become an accountant because we need them. And then the individual realises a few years later that they absolutely despise it. But yeah, I do think actually it can be a really hugely valuable and pleasurable thing to also go through as well, various parts of your life.
Do you know the thing that I wish that I had learned actually quite seriously is I wish I had learned how to live with other people. I think that would be a basic thing in education, is if we would learn how to have communities and live with other people and have conflicts that actually end in resolution.
Mm-hmm. It comes back to your point about education, not allowing access to that kind of questioning, critical theory education for everybody, and that part of learning to be a community, because obviously within capitalist structures, individualism and isolation serves us better because we buy ourselves community, we buy ourselves connection rather than actually finding that, and that's free and that's cheap. But we don't learn that. We don't learn, like what you're saying about if we could learn that we're instinctively wired that way as children to collaborate, but somehow we reach adulthood and we're on these singular isolated paths.
Well, I think emotional intelligence needs to be taught because society looks the way it does, because it is so toxic in those ways. Then I kind of wish that was a thing that we actually studied.
I think so, and be able to change our minds and be inquiring and realise that, you know, ideas develop and we develop, and having that.
Thank you so much to our panellists. There's a really great feminist phrase, the personal is political, and I feel tonight you've really shared a lot of both the personal and the political of yourselves. So yes, a massive thank you to our guests, Clementine Burnley, Jessica Gaitán Johannesson, Maryam Hamidi and Emma Pollock.
Yeah, and just Quines Cast is brought to you by Stella Quines, and you can find out more about us on the internet, and you can also find the previous episodes of our podcast.
This episode of Quines Cast was curated and presented by Hannah Lavery and Caitlin Skinner. Editor Helena Rafai, project producer Barbie Lyon, sound engineer David Key. Stella Quines team are General Manager Barbie Lyon, Associate Director of Engagement Beth Godfrey, Artistic Director and CEO Caitlin Skinner, Company Administrator and Young Quines producer Erin McGee. Quines Cast image by Juliet Francis Dugan. Our event at the Book Festival was supported by Sir Ewan and Lady Brown, and Quines Cast is possible because of funding from Creative Scotland and support from our partners, the Travers Theatre, and our supporters, the Quines Collective.